Miloš Merjak.
Hello, thanks for coming to my talk. The background of my talk is essentially like once in a time looking at basically security, how it should be on a laptop. Because if I look around, people essentially kind of seem to have capitulated about securing laptops. So I did some thinking about the problem, and this is basically a slide set with my thoughts around that. So my background is in the open hardware, open software community. And I did various projects around RFID, some access control systems, some art installation with blinking lights, RFID tracking systems, and Xbox hacking. And I'm also always been interested in chip security, photography, and in my previous job at ARM, I was developing hypervisors for microcontrollers. So to understand better where I'm coming from, let me give you a quick overview of kind of the threats I'm interested in, and then let's see basically how we can address these in an ideally simple way. Yeah, I need to keep pressing this button. Okay. So although I think you are very aware of traditional malware on laptops, so I won't bore you with that, like traditional application-based malware. So the type of malware that I'm interested in is the one that is A, hard to spot, and B, very hard to remove. So for example, this type of malware, for example, as discovered around 2018, becomes resident in one of the many non-volatile memories in your system. And even if you reinstall Windows, and even if you reinstall all software, if you exchange your hard disk, you will still have that basically malware running. And whenever you install a new Windows, it will again compromise that during the boot. And also, I think worth noticing on this type of malware is that this is not state-level actors, but most likely like private hackers that essentially just became more and more sophisticated over the years. So to talk about the other side of the coin is nation-state actors. And here we have a very similar picture. So essentially infection of non-volatile memories in, for example, servers, and again becoming resident even after exchanging hard disks, even in a sense bypassing security concepts like, for example, hard disk encryption, because like if I have enough money, then I can develop essentially malware that runs in like this invisible or most invisible system management mode, where basically even while the operating system is running, I can perform basically modification or backdooring of the system. So this documentation is from 2008. So you can rest assured that that type of technology either trickled down already or is trickling down again to private actors. And so the other thing which keeps popping up is like, how often do you leave your laptop unattended, for example, when you're traveling, right? So like if you go swimming, for example, in a hotel, of course you won't take your laptop, right? Like nobody with a sane mind can expect from you to take your laptop while you are swimming. Nobody can expect, for example, to always take your laptop while going to the toilet. Like people can ask for that, but reality is people won't do it. They just leave it, whatever, in a cafe with a locked screen. And turns out that even having a laptop for less than 5 minutes unattended, I can perform this kind of backdooring by infecting non-volatile memories. And because once I got access, it's unclear how that access propagates. It's unclear essentially how to recover from that, unless you know exactly what the malware does, and that is usually very hard to analyze because the malware is usually gone after basically the infection has been done and the final payload deployed to your system. So I think we all seen basically numerous news articles, like, for example, the fake news Bloomberg article. But there are some security researchers that essentially try to see, okay, like, what is the effort of infecting a system? Like, if I have briefly access to it, what type of hardware can I deploy to compromise the system? And again, turns out it's pretty straightforward because, like, today's microcontrollers, they have not only flash memory included, so non-volatile storage, they have RAM, they can generate clocks, so I need basically no external components to use these kinds of chips, and this is, in this slide, is a pretty naive approach where a comparably big chip is used, but let's say if we would be serious about that type of attack, there are better ways, which also will be close to invisible on X-ray, by, for example, using Z-conductive tape. We can glue chip ties, and the telltale on X-ray, where we, for example, would see bonding wires and the pins, they would be completely gone in that hardware. And also the chip dies these days are in square millimeters, so not like basically like this nearly centimeter by centimeter device. Essentially, in a summary, like we have basically like traditional or simple malware that runs usually on the main CPU. It might run in the system management mode where it's very hard to detect, or like I think this type of attack, it's called blue pill attack, is also well known since 20 years or so, where basically I run the operating system essentially inside a hypervisor compartment. But for advanced malware, we have much better opportunities here. So, for example, any of these points that I list here, like SSD network, Intel management mode, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, WAN, Thunderbolt adapter, SD card, USB devices, that's not just an educated guess. These are all real examples from the past 10, 15 years of security research where people did prove that to infect basically these deeply embedded devices which are not obvious to normal users, like the bad USB attacks. For example, one of my favorite is ICU attack, where in a MacBook, essentially they were not just able to become resident on the camera, which gives you essentially USB access to your machine, so you can do remote control effectively, but also turning off essentially the LED indication that someone is eavesdropping or watching your activity. And also recently, I think whenever like the previous attacks were essentially what I would call either supply chain attacks or attacks during the life cycle of the device. But I think in today's products, we need to realistically admit that we have to think about supply chain in a much wider sense that we are used to. So supply chain for me definitely would include software updates, because like whenever I have a critical device, I would of course expect software updates for at least like 2 years during the warranty, and ideally a bit longer, so I can recover essentially from being vulnerable on the internet with my devices. And for example, it has been demonstrated, for example, with Asus, that someone hijacked Asus software distribution servers for a very, very targeted attack. Essentially, there were essentially a list of hashes of MAC addresses, and only for a list of like 50 or 100 MAC addresses, the malware would become active. So this is basically, I think it's interesting like from 2 aspects. One is basically what level of effort makes sense for example, most likely nation state actor in this case, to compromise like 100 computers by essentially hijacking the servers of essentially a big computer company. But it also shows that actually we are not in control of our hardware anymore, right? Because like if I have a clean installation of my Windows computer, so even if I take my laptop as a binary store, reinstall Windows from the original basically Microsoft images, it will pick up on that this is an Asus computer, and it will install Asus drivers and application software that will run privileged on my laptop. So I'm not basically in control of like who executes software on my computers. And to that extent, of course, like in order to run an ASUS laptop, I of course need a huge amount of drivers, and they also run like privileged, and this allows me, for example, to then become resident on the machine and like uninstall my infection path. So what's the takeaway then? Should we just capitulate? I think you are on a security conference, and I think what everyone of us did see is like all the cool kids have like these stickers on their webcams, which I personally like. I don't care very much about my webcam. What I care much more is, for example, my audio interfaces. So if someone can basically covertly record my communication, and like even disabling Wi-Fi access doesn't stop an attacker from that, right? Because I have infinite storage on the machine, so I can essentially record basically all the time, and whenever I briefly get network connectivity or I see a USB flash drive, I can exfiltrate that data to possible attackers. So this is one way, just giving up and attaching stickers. There are some cases, I think if you Google for it, I've seen there was a German computer magazine that went through the effort, like removing microphone chips and whatnot from the laptop, but that is not something we can realistically expect from normal users. On top of that, also the threat model is completely broken. So people usually are very obsessed about integrity of the bottom part of the laptop. But for example, what very few people realize that, for example, if I can just take off my display frame, I have access to USB interface. I can replace, for example, the USB webcam, because the camera in the top of your laptop is usually USB based. I can replace it by malicious hardware and even use the same USB ID, so it becomes undetected even on a corporate laptop. So it's very hard to protect basically contemporary laptop because people fail to understand which part of the laptop is problematic. And for that, essentially, what I just like to give you is a quick overview over basically how complex that problem is. So I took apart essentially the laptop you see here in this presentation, and just to give you an idea. So the example I'm currently working on is the Lenovo ThinkPad Carbon X1, 7th generation, which just came out like 1 or 2 months ago. And the idea is that basically creating a software which secures this specific laptop. And by latching on a laptop that is just fresh on the market, my expectation is that for the next 12 months, we can keep on buying this laptop. And for example, if you're interested in joining this development process, then I invite you to get one of these and then benefit from the findings that we can jointly have. So this is essentially how the laptop looks like once you open it. The choice of this specific laptop was intentional. For example, it has interesting features like, for example, the RAM being soldered to the main board. It's not just soldered, but it's glued with really nasty glue that doesn't really go off if you even heat the chip to high degrees. And that directly really makes the attacker's life painful to perform cold boot attacks. Because of the length of the talk, I won't be able to go into that, but this is type of the threats that I'm interested in. Like if I have disk encryption, how can I get hold of the key? And a cold boot attack is of interest for me, and therefore what I acknowledge here positively is that, for example, the module has footprints around the 4 memory chips that allows me to solder a metal shield over that and underfill that metal shield with epoxy. So I can even increase that level of security if I want. But on the downside, what I discovered when doing that research, there is a magic button which is reachable by pinhole, and with that I can bypass the shutdown procedure, which simplifies cold boot attacks if I would be able to pull them off via DMA or similar. So here we see one of the core security features of this laptop, which is the so-called trusted platform module. That trusted platform module is tied in with anti-tamper features. For example, it can block security keys when basically the lid is taken off. It's like a very basic security measure. If you know what the chip is, of course, you can bypass it. But again, you slow down the attacker. And for example, a 5-minute attack is absolutely unlikely with this laptop. So you can just increase the effort. So for example, if you go, for example, through a border control with your laptop, that kind of attack with some other features I will explain in a few slides will be much less likely. And second, this chip is a custom development by Lenovo. So on the top, you see basically the chip ID. If you removed epoxy of the chip and use a microscope, it's some customized chip, which seems to be a fairly high security. It's highly integrated, fairly complex. It has the anti-tamper features we expect on chip level. It has security measures that, for example, would detect active attacks while the chip is powered. And further on, even if the battery runs totally empty, it's buffered by a coin cell, which is in yellow on the bottom. And it detects the removal of the battery, so it would forget essentially its secret and therefore make this type of attack uninteresting. So here is the same mainboard with a few more components removed. The interesting feature here is that we have 2 types of non-volatile flashes. We yet need to analyze this security measures. So the suspicion is that the big flash, of course, is holding the computer's BIOS, essentially 2 copies of it. So if one crashes, it can fall back to the other. But the other memory, my best guess is it's used for saving settings, like for example, public key pairs for secure boot and whatnot. So, but I still need to dump these memories. So on the back side, it's a bit more crazy. So there are at least 3-4 custom chips which are special for Lenovo laptops. Some of them, even though they have a custom lasering of Lenovo and ThinkPad and ThinkEngine and whatnot, turns out that some of them actually are microchip from the company Microchip microcontrollers. But again, like very, very highly integrated. So we realistically suspect like several megabytes of code just being hidden in these chips total. And it makes a lot of sense because like in a modern laptop, for example, one of the things you need to do is, for example, power management, right? So by very quickly switching between different power levels and frequencies, you can use much less power, right? And it's impossible to do that in software, so usually this is outsourced in these special microcontrollers, which are then made for the purpose. But the problem, of course, is also like a very vulnerable place to be, because if I have full control over the power management, I can suddenly do things like bypassing secure boot and whatnot, because with glitching, I can then affect the execution of code on these laptops. So therefore, for me, it's not desirable to have the code changed. And if the code is changed, I have no chance finding out about it, because what I expect is copy protection bits to be set, and the effort for extracting that firmware would be high. But realistically, let's say if I'm willing to spend, let's say $4,000 to $6,000 for each of the chips, I can have the firmware extracted. So there is this one really highly integrated, like more integrated than any others, this weird complex stacked dice thing in the top right corner. So that basically chip just broke into pieces when I did the decapping, because it was like not just like multiple levels of chip directly soldered on top of each other, which is something I've never seen. So it's not a classical package on package where you then have bonding wires and connecting basically to chips, but they were like directly soldered on top of each other, which we need to develop a method on how to get these apart without breaking it into pieces. But this one was crazy complex and also very big. So I think this alone is probably megabytes of code running inside that. So all in all, we see like, even let's say hypothetically, if we would spend, let's say $500,000 or more in verifying the security of that, we would not learn even half of the potential problems of that. So long story short, this is something which we need to capitulate right now. That is something we can't address, and I have some thoughts on how we can make this problem less impactful. So the housing itself is pretty nice. It's magnesium based, so it's very light, but metal. So it protects automatically because it's highly conductive against foreign injection attacks, and also probably makes side channel attacks, so extracting cryptographic keys, harder. So all in all, I think that is, this is plus. And there is a fingerprint sensor. I'm not sure if we do anything with it, because traditionally we don't trust fingerprint sensors very much, because there are a lot of attacks which usually the sensor won't be able to distinguish, where we basically are able to take off fingerprints from glasses and whatnot and create fingerprint templates to bypass the type of sensor. So whether we make any use of that is TBD. So now let's have a look at my thoughts on how could we get some trust back. So I don't want these stickers on my laptop. That's just silly, because it just tells myself and everybody else that I just gave up control of my hardware. So disclaimer, anyone can create a security system that they themselves can't break. So this is certainly true for me. So I can create a nice security system which I can't break, but that doesn't mean that a 12-year-old kid in Norway can't break that overnight. So there's the disclaimer. But if we basically step back, what kind of like the high-level requirements can we post on this laptop? So A, the laptop is not supposed to look special. If it has like the ports glued shut, if it has like weird bulges with additional anti-tamper features, it doesn't go well. Like people see this is a special laptop and people will want that. Like we don't want that. We want to look as a normal person. We don't want to sit in an airport where we use the latest CubesOS. I will explain what CubesOS is, with different colors and whatnot, and telling people, okay, like either like I'm a tinfoil hat or I'm doing important stuff. So this is not something what I want to have for my users. And I also don't want to be smug about security and saying, okay, like, yeah, if you want security, you have to use Linux because Windows is doomed anyway. Like, this is not the way. So what you need to do is, like, you need to reach to your users and make sure, like, if they want to use Windows, they can use it safely, but it's our responsibility to make it as painless as possible to do that. Then, in order to make sure that the user does not leave the laptop unattended very often, it needs to be better, light, small, so I actually have a standing chance to schlepping it around effectively. So ultra portable for the X1, just to give you a number, it's like sub 1 kilogram. So it's like super, super light, and but yet it's insanely powerful. Then I don't want to trust my Windows updates, because like when I install some application software, I have just no control over what is going on there, right? So what I want to have is, like, for example, in an enterprise environment, somebody that has a second pair of eyes on my network traffic. And how cool would it be if that second pair of eyes will also exist while I'm traveling, right? If I have a trusted second pair of eyes that, for example, is able to watch my network traffic and detect malicious activity or someone talking back to a command control server, or, for example, trying to do weird things over my USB interface while I'm charging my laptop, right? This is all stuff like a user should not be bothered with. That should go away, right? And one of the solutions I identified is to create basically this trust and security virtualization. I will go into that into detail in the next slides. And once I have that laptop and it's tied to me, I can't send it in anymore for repair. Like at this point, I'm on my own. So if the thing breaks, warranty left or right, I can't send it in. Not gonna happen. So what I need to be able to do, I need to have a reasonable chance to repair my laptop. So for enterprise environment, of course, it's easier. If, for example, like normal repair activity, like replacing a screen or a disk, can be done by IT. And if we look at generally at enterprise laptops, they come with manuals that explain how do I exchange parts that break. So I can do like some baseline maintenance of these myself. If my keyboard breaks, I can swap that keyboard. It takes me some time, but I can have it done by trusted party. So I think this is, an important aspect. I want to minimize the attack surface as much as possible, just removing unused crap. So I don't have to worry about what might basically be hidden in like gigabytes of application software or in operating systems, and to solve and address the problem of not being able to take basically my 1 kg laptop swimming, right? Because I still have that problem. I want to have a physical crypto token. If I unplug that, the laptop should go into basically a disk suspend, and then basically the secrets are concentrated around basically that key. So if I unplug that key, the only thing I need to worry about that is that before I plug in that laptop, that key back into my laptop, that I verified anti-tamper features, which I will explain in a second. And basically at that point, I enter my password, but without the key, it's impossible to decrypt the data on it. And essentially do as many factors as possible. So in this case, 3 factors. So in summary, essentially, the supply chain attacks we can basically make much harder by not ordering the laptop online. Like if I'm a person of interest, then instead of buying it on Amazon and risk supply chain attacks, I would go to brick and mortar stores. So I myself, I'm not so interesting, I guess, so I would just go into my local city, just not around the corner, but whatever, 2 blocks further. But for someone that really cares, might even have to buy it in a different city or in another country. So there has been precedents, without going into details, for the SCADA attacks, that local suppliers were compromised with infected USB sticks. So this is, I think, a credible threat, and by just buying the stuff in cash, I also can hide what did I buy in the end of the day from basically a brick and mortar store, and it might not know the precise version and the origin of, let's say, my ThinkPad laptop. And then I want to perform additional hardening. So for secure boot, like for very old platforms, you might be able to use core boot and completely replace the BIOS. But for modern platforms, you would go for UEFI, and you would just basically, there are possibilities to remove modules from the UEFI BIOS to become inactive if you don't need them. So we can again reduce attack surface, basically buy, for example, an SKU of the laptop without remote management interface and so on. But secure boot, I think for most people is good enough, as long as we protect settings, data in the boot process. And then basically the key difference is that instead of trying to protect an operating system, which is like, let's say, 100 gigabytes big, like I don't have a chance to find security holes in that. I have a tiny, slim operating system. In our case, I recommend Linux, which runs invisibly under Windows and can perform all these verifications. We'll see that in a second. And then we want to use modern security features like IOMMU to even protect against malicious hardware that might have DMA busmaster attacks, or if someone could bypass, for example, the BIOS settings, for example, and uses, for example, malicious Thunderbolt adapters and whatnot. So IOMMU is useful there, and we better use that. And basically, inside this trusted shell, we then run our untrusted OS. And again, to not annoy the user, we want the one thing that we want to give the user not virtualized is the GPU, because it's just painful if I go to a conference, connect my laptop, and it doesn't recognize the screen, right? I want to use HDMI. I want to switch resolutions and whatnot, so I better have the native driver. But because of the IOMMU, I have protection of my trusted operating system against DMA attacks that would otherwise result in a leakage of keys or other information, or actually compromising of my hardened OS. And as time and time was shown in the last years, the disk encryption in Windows is inherently untrusted. So Microsoft now is stepping a huge way back, and for BitLocker, they will disable the hardware disk encryption, I think in a month or so, because they just capitulated. There were too many bad eggs in SSD manufacturers where they messed up the implementation. There was a big paper that was published like half a year ago where they basically just hacked like 5 or 6 major SSD disks and were able to extract the secrets either from the disk or perform hot swap attacks where I basically unplug the SSD disk while it's running, and turns out the disk is unencrypted at this point and I can read out all the data. So long story short, even Microsoft is giving up on that, but still, like, rather than just doing this cat and mouse, I want to understand what my encryption does, and I want to be sure that it's very hard to crack the user's password. With Linux disk encryption, LUX2, there are very modern password hashing algorithms which defeat essentially GPU cracking and are like super slow in cracking farms. So basically, I need to spend like one physical computer to have approximately 2 guesses per second, even if the thing has like 8 CPUs. And if I want to guess faster, I need more computers. So it becomes quickly very painful for the attacker to break even trivial passwords. So one of my favorite countermeasures, which is very low effort, is basically nail polish. So we can use fancy glitter. And the idea is, we cover the screw holes and the screws with that. And like if you ever had a screw with lacquer cover, it's like super painful to anything with it. So you have to scratch it off and it just takes ages. But on top of that, you can do very smart things. So you use glitter with microstructure. And then you can basically do a blink comparison, it's called, where you essentially take, you have one reference picture after you apply this coating and it dried. And then, for example, if you come back from a business trip or from a holiday, you perform this optical verification where you take another photo from the same angle and then just flip quickly back and forward between the 2 images, and all differences between these 2 images will result in movement. It's a pretty nice attack. A pretty nice countermeasure. We implemented that, for example, with our X-ray imaging system to just quickly understand the changes between 2 basically complex devices. But this is something which is perfectly user accessible. The only thing you need is a normal phone, and make sure to basically, once you bought the computer, the first thing you do, you would attach this nail polish. So this is, in my opinion, way cooler than stupid stickers on your laptop. And you see basically at that point, if you assume that you got basically the laptop from an anonymous source, like a brick and mortar store, in combination with the nail polish, you can continue trusting that device. So the thing I will talk about next, which is this virtualization-based security, is definitely not new. So for example, Microsoft started basically launching that as a research project already, I think 2008 or so. And essentially the idea is to have a hypervisor and everything that I care about, for example, encryption routines, for example, my SSL protocol handling and whatnot, I move into a different domain. And the kernel running in this different hypervisor domain, I can make much slimmer because it does not need to talk to hardware. And if I can dramatically reduce the code base of my kernel, so instead of having like many megabytes of kernel, I can have, for example, let's say a megabyte or 2 of kernel, which is also then have a standing chance to perform a decent security verification. And the core aspects like the protocol, I can even formally verify. And others did an amazing job on that. Like someone that did it very consequently is like this Mirage OS. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I highly recommend reading about that. Essentially, they not just performed verification on a mathematical level of protocols, but they also applied it to real-world protocols like SSL. So it's provably securely implemented. And on top of that, they run these small trustlet in hypervisor compartments. So this is a freely available operating system that you can just download and run on hypervisor platforms. On the top of that, of the page, you see 2 images of CubesOS, and this is like the geeky versions. If you're a Linux person, you probably have CubesOS installed. You get fancy stuff like different borders for different windows, and for For example, let's say the red border window can only exchange data with the other red border windows, but it's not something I can realistically explain to, let's say, my parents, and it's certainly not something I can explain to an average Joe employee. So if someone wants to use Windows again, like, let's basically try to make an effort to have decent security. So what we have now is essentially these hypervisor compartments, and the latest CPUs have basically this feature called VTD. It's a virtualization that allows pass-through of the graphics card. So I can basically like pass through the graphics card to my virtual client, and I lose negligible performance from that, which is pretty cool. And the IOMMU protects me against other devices that might try to perform DMA access. So if, for example, I would be forced to add additional peripherals into that domain, I can perform this IOMMU protection. And for example, if someone, for example, tries to exploit Thunderbolt or other interfaces, at least on some machines, IOMMU is correctly implemented, and it would be fine because it would filter out like a firewall these types of communication to a domain that does not own peripheral currently. So the external USB crypto token, there is a various range. We basically originally tried to use YubiKey, which probably many of you will know. But it turns out that for market segmentation reasons, they made the stupid choice to disable secure messaging. So I can't unfortunately go into details with that, but essentially it allows me eavesdropping on my unlock secrets, which is unacceptable because I want to be sure that even accidentally the employee can't lose the cryptographic secret inside that stick. So this is something we need to take guarantee for granted, that like only the person that has the crypto key in their possession can unlock the computer. It should not be possible to clone it. But with absence of secure messaging, we don't see a good way for doing that. And external interfaces like LTE, Wi-Fi, and USB, we want to protect in depth. So for example, in Linux, there is a USB guard project, which is very easy to use, which essentially not just detects vendor and product IDs of USB devices, but also detects the type and any even minute changes on the behavior of the USB descriptors will be reliably detected, and I can basically disable these devices before they even are connected to my virtual compartment. Then for my hardened Linux system, I can do whatever I want in terms of file system. So in Linux, there are two major projects, which is dmcrypt and dmverity. Dmcrypt is for encrypting disks. dmverity is for ensuring that on a block level, no changes has been done to the file system, and I can tie that into my trusted platform module and identify changes before even a password is unlocked from the TPM or the USB device, which is pretty cool. Then on top of that, I want a user password, because if someone can steal the USB key from me, I still want to be safe. And by having a user password, I can do the so-called plausible deniability system, because many of you, I think, face the situation where in a border control, you need to show that your laptop works. You certainly don't want to show the border guard your laptop with your actual work system. So you want to essentially show the border guard a different compartment which doesn't have any critical software, right? Or data stored on it. So this is called plausible deniability, and by just entering a different password, I can basically branch the key derivation to basically have two options for two completely separate Windows systems that also don't leak between each other. So this looks scary, but it's pretty straightforward. So the orange part is the hypervisor domain, and as you can see, basically the red arrows that go across essentially to the blue hardened Linux part, these are all virtualized interfaces. There's no direct access to any hardware by the virtualized system. only the graphics chip. And by using then specialized drivers, like these Virt.io drivers, this doesn't come at a performance cost. Right? So we don't have to virtualize these components. We use these Virt.io drivers that we can install in Windows, and they give basic direct access to keyboard, touchpad, sound, USB camera. But the beauty here is that whenever basically I'm in a trusted environment, I can ask the hardened Linux system to unplug sound and, for example, webcam, to not be even visible to the Windows system, right? So I can have policies around that. And the disk, essentially as far as Windows is concerned, is unencrypted, but the Linux system below that actually does basically multiple levels of encryption. One is the Linux LUX2 encryption, and on the bottom end, just as an anti-tamper feature, the technically not very secure Opal encryption as it's currently used in BitLocker systems. And with that, I can have basically an instant wipe of the system in case, for example, I feel threatened or in case we have advanced tamper events. And on the right side, you see the secure USB token. And I can not only use it for the volume encryption, but I can also use it to store my VPN credentials and my disk encryption key derivation or part of it inside that. So when I unplug that, like there is no way I can retrieve these keys. And in Windows, I have direct access to the GPU, but even the mainboard is out, basically. Even the mainboard is emulated by QEMU. So none of the non-volatile memories, nothing is directly accessible. It's all emulated by the hypervisor, and like no changes can basically leak back into my system. And on top of that, I can do cool things like having snapshots. That's, for example, when I'm traveling, I can make sure even if I catch malware briefly, I can revert on a block level to a previous version. So even if, for example, I want to try out a software that I don't trust, I can basically in, for example, QEMU, just roll back to a previous snapshot and have block by block the same version that I had, for example, this morning. So there's no way a malware can become resident in this scenario. So there's one weakness here, which is the USB camera. So right now, the USB camera would be connected directly. So there is some basic security with USB guard to detect if the camera suddenly turns into a keyboard or something. But I would regard this security as, let's say, medium security. In order to fix that, actually, what we would need is kind of a firewall for USB. So to my knowledge, it does not exist yet. That is something, if we would be really serious about security, which we would like to implement. But other than that, I think it's pretty secure. So if we, for example, add anti-tamper features, for example, with the nail polish onto the screen bezel as well, I think we are in a good situation. Okay, so the last two slides, just to prove that the thing is not just made up in my sick brain. You can download the slides later. And what you find here is basically the actual configuration of QEMU to run that system. It took me like more than 100 hours to get that running, so I hope it gives you some head start. And essentially what you see here is, for example, line by line, that, for example, a native QEMU instance is started with basically a classic BIOS, not basically UEFI BIOS. It's an older mainboard that is emulated. The hypervisor detection is suppressed. So as far as Windows is concerned, it's not running in a hypervisor. And basically the second line, this device, VFIO PCI, is basically all the magic you need to insert the graphics card into a virtual machine, and that has some additional complexity, like we need to reverse engineer the built-in BIOS, extract the VGA BIOS from that because it's compiled in, it's an integrated chipset, but once we extracted that, we can pass that to QEMU and boot a system which correctly initializes the graphics driver and is able to boot Windows. So the other two aspects which are interesting, for example, here, mouse and keyboard support is directly tied to the built-in keyboard and built-in track point. So if, for example, you would add a USB keyboard and mouse, it would not affect this system, which is pretty neat. And then to make sure that we have decent security, we also want to give the system access to the hardware random number generator, the time, and we want to pass through, in the last 2 lines, the webcam, which is this NEC USB X HCI, where we actually emulate a USB controller. And to round things up, when you install that USB image that we were running here, what you need to do is you briefly boot the system with VGA emulation. So you have basically a visible screen. You can perform all the installation. You can install the Intel graphics drivers. And once Intel graphics drivers are installed, you can reboot in the configuration of the previous slide. But essentially, this prepare target in the makefile is essentially meant to connect both the Windows installation CD and the virtual I/O drivers that are necessary for getting high-speed access to disk and network. And again, we are connecting the webcam to make sure that the drivers are installed. And we temporarily create here this VGA display, which runs essentially in Linux, even remotely. The other commands, just for reference, are, for example, snapshot commands. We can list all snapshots. We can have named snapshots. This is essentially like Git, but for operating systems, which is pretty sweet. So I won't bore you with that, but essentially, Windows boots in 3 to 4 seconds, which is pretty sweet. And it's just like as quick as a normal system. And the only pain was the instruction of this UEFI BIOS, keyboard and mouse support. Like I try to explain my kids that, have a look, like I have this Windows computer, and if I type stuff, it appears on the screen, and I can even move the mouse. They fail to understand why I was excited about that. But that is one of the things that you start to appreciate after 100 hours of staring at the black screen. And yeah, so the decapping imaging, it's way more thorough than basically the few examples I gave you about decapping the chips. So we will do more work on that. So the further steps, I basically skip over that. So one of the things which are interesting to make it useful, I want to pass the Wi-Fi configuration into Windows. So essentially what I need to implement is a server process where I can basically change the Wi-Fi configuration while I'm traveling. And the other thing is, instead of using YubiKey, I identified this Java Jacob card. They are super cheap, and you can run your own code on a very secure controller, and you can implement essentially any type of security you want in your USB key. And what I found is basically keychain-sized readers where I can plug in this Jacob card and have it on a keychain. So with that, I have also trusted USB crypto token rather than having like a broken by design YubiKey. Okay, so questions. So sorry for overrunning, but I'm the last talk, so I hope I had your patience. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And yeah, of course, we are hiring. So Zenit Labs allowed me to destroy a $2,000 laptop for performing this decapping. So this is one of the benefits of working for Zenit Labs. So like, it's a very supportive environment. So if you're interested, please contact me.
Any questions from the audience? None yet? Then we'll head to the Slido.
Yes, so have phones been the target of physical attacks? How similar, different is the threat model compared to laptop? So that's a very good question. Unfortunately, on phones, we can't perform this type of countermeasures. The reason is that on modern phones, we don't have access to secure boot process. When you buy a modern phone, the secure boot is fused to manufacturer-endorsed code, and that essentially allows you only to run code after essentially the hypervisor is already running. So it turns out that modern phones run a hypervisor for example, supporting real-time communication and baseband operation. But unfortunately, like for an existing phone, you can't do anything. The only thing you can do is build your own phone, which is coincidentally something that Dark Matter is doing. But like, unfortunately, this is the best answer. Like a phone, you are done for. You can just pick your poison, and that's it. What about just not switching to Linux and learn Linux plus not installing any unknown hardware and buying unknown laptop models? How to check hardware your PC laptop is running? So again, like once your laptop was exposed for a certain time, I think there's not much you can do anymore. So you have to hope, or at some point, like say, okay, from this point I start trusting the laptop, and then like very carefully inspect stuff. But even on a Linux system, this is incredibly hard. So like some of you might have noticed that, for example, if you have a modern Linux distribution, it not just updates the software, but it also happens to update your firmware that runs on your mainboard. So basically downloads firmware updates that are applied on the next reboot. Also, basically various hardware like modems and whatnot are also silently updated by Linux. So unless you basically create your own distribution, I don't believe you can do that. Or maybe there are some super paranoid distributions, but in many of these cases, their threat model probably is not your threat model. So like whatever you have, you need to see whether they are worried about the same things that you are worried. What about external keyloggers that are connected to keyboard? So that is the beauty of the external security module. So hypothetically, someone watches me with a camera typing my hard disk password. Because there is this additional feature required, the TPM that's built in the laptop, and the external security token, unless they have bypassed the security of both of them, they won't be able to unlock that disk. So even if someone watches you, locks your keyboard, like they can't do anything with it. Is physical hardening of one's machine something worthwhile to consider, such as applying tamper-resistant seals to screw joints, maybe? Yes, absolutely. So like I have a very mean idea to just mess with forensic specialists. So imagine you would be evil enough to put an accelerometer in your desktop machine. So, and then basically they would need, when they transport the desktop machine with their special power to their van, they basically would not be allowed to move it, let's say, more than 2 degrees, don't give any bumps into it. So yes, of course, I think this is a fun topic. I claim this framework would apply equally to a desktop, but the desktop has different security problems. So you would, for example, add like this accelerometer, because normally a desktop should just stick under your desk and it should not move, so we can use that to advantage. We can do things like whenever it's moving, it goes into disk suspend. So any forensic attack against your memory by unplugging the RAM, performing cold boot attack would be ineffective, because they would need to open basically the case and not triggering the acceleration sensor. So in many mainboards there are tamper switches included. You would just expand them to basically your outer case. But also on top of that, like the nail polish security thing applies very well to your desktop, right? So you would apply a security sticker and then cover the borders of the security sticker with nail polish. I think that's the best thing you can do, and from time to time you check whether something bad has happened. And like even if an attacker with crazy solvents would try to bypass that, the problem is that it slows the attacker down. The risk of being discovered is much higher. So anything that you can throw into the hacker's path is a good thing. Is there any BTC, Bitcoin miner, malware hardware that is used your hardware to mine on your PC? I'm not aware on firmware resident, but like Bitcoin miners are a big thing. So it would use the GPU, which the malware would have access to because of the virtualization where we give access to the GPU. But the beauty is that from the outside, we can measure the activity of the CPU. We can measure the temperature. So if basically bad things happen, we can have at least a log and can, for example, identify when was this malware installed. Or, for example, a snapshot feature we can then roll back. Or, for example, imagine you have a crypto Trojan that encrypts a hard disk. You just roll back to a previous snapshot. The crypto Trojan is gone. Your data, admittedly, of the last 2 weeks is gone as well, but at least you have the data for the last years back by just using the snapshot feature. Yeah, and the point is, like, because it's snapshotting, it's not expensive, right? Every time you take a snapshot, it's just the difference in data that has been changed since the last time occupies your disk, which is pretty cool. Yeah, so thanks, unless there are any more questions.
Thank you very much, Milos. Unfortunately, this is the last talk we're having today. Tomorrow at 9